All right. All right. Uh, Before we start, we would just like to remind you of our Zoom protocols. So please turn off your microphone when not speaking and click the raise hand button for interventions. Use the chat box to ask questions, give insights, and interact with other attendees. And for questions regarding the presentations, you may send them through the chat or raise them later at the open discussion. During then, please click raise hand so you may be acknowledged and unmute to speak. Interpretation is available in French and Spanish. To hear your desired language, click the globe icon on the bottom of your Zoom app and click Spanish or French. Also, click mute other audio to avoid audio interference. So welcome everyone. Uh, I will be your facilitator today. I am Bruno Benohar, Policy Associate for the Reality of Aid Network. Reality of Aid Network is a Southern-led North-South network for aid policy and reform and is a member of the CPDE's Private Sector Engagement Task Force. So good morning to our colleagues in Northern and Latin America, good afternoon to our colleagues in Africa and Europe, and good evening to our colleagues here in Asia and the Pacific. Welcome to the Private Sector Watch Research Learning Session. So this learning session on private sector engagement and development cooperation is organized by CPDE's Private Sector Engagement Task Force, which is a part of its Private Sector Watch initiative. The CPDE's Private Sector Watch is an initiative through the European Commission where regions and sections will conduct case study research on private sector engagement through development cooperation in their respective areas, with particular attention to multinational and transnational operations. If task force members wish to have their countries represented in the research, they may collaborate with the regions and sectors to conduct the case study research. For this learning session, we aim to level up understanding and expectations among constituencies regarding their case study research. We will also discuss the CSO Handbook on monitoring private sector engagement in development cooperation, as well as guidelines for the private sector watch research to be conducted by the constituency. Now, to kick off the event and give the opening remarks is a representative of the CPDE's Private Sector Engagement Task Force. She heads the Red Nicaragüense de Comercio Comunitario, or RENIC, and is also the chairperson of the Reality of Aid Network. From Nicaragua, please welcome Georgina Muñoz Pavon.
Hola, ¿me escuchan? Hola. Buenos días a todos y todas. Hola, ¿me escuchan?
Yes, we can hear you.
Bien, gracias. Un saludo desde Latinoamérica a todos ustedes en esta sesión de trabajo de la AOD sobre la participación del sector privado. Sabemos que desde la creación de la OED se ha centrado un compromiso sobre la responsabilidad del sector privado como uno de sus objetivos políticos para dar seguimiento a este sector que está también avanzando en una serie de iniciativas de participación y que nos interesa desde la OED estar dando seguimiento y organizando diferentes reuniones e investigaciones que venimos desarrollando en meses anteriores. Como parte de la reestructuración de la OED en este año 2021, el grupo de trabajo de la AOD sobre el compromiso del sector privado fue convocado prácticamente en mayo, ¿verdad? Con el objetivo principal de cómo buscar resultados positivos de las intervenciones del sector privado en la cooperación al desarrollo, tanto a nivel nacional como a nivel subnacional. Prácticamente este proceso lo está dirigiendo, creo que ya lo mencionaba Bruno, por Reality of ID y Global Network. Y prácticamente también participan diferentes organizaciones de sociedad civil a nivel voluntario. El grupo de trabajo tiene diferentes objetivos para alcanzar esto. Primero, el facilitar la producción de investigaciones que puedan ser basadas en pruebas sobre la aplicación por parte de los actores del sector privado en esas normas mínimas de rendición de cuentas, prácticamente relacionado con los principios de Kampala. Esto tiene que ver también con su vínculo directo con la Agenda 2030, sobre todo sobre diferentes objetivos que ahí se plantean en el ámbito económico, comercial, de erradicación de pobreza, o ámbitos como cambio climático, campo energético. Prácticamente es vinculante a una serie de objetivos de la AOD, perdón, de la Agenda 2030, y que la AOD da seguimiento también a través de las diferentes circunscripciones. Queremos aumentar también la capacidad de la OSC para supervisar la participación del sector privado en la cooperación al desarrollo y utilizar las pruebas generadas por las OSC en los espacios de promoción de la rendición de cuentas del sector privado, por ejemplo, todo lo que hacemos con la Alianza la Alianza Global de Cooperación Eficaz al Desarrollo, toda la labor del CAT a través de la OCDE y los procesos conexos que tienen que ver directamente con los procesos de Naciones Unidas. Hay antecedentes en el trabajo que hacemos desde este seguimiento al sector privado y que tiene que ver con el observatorio del sector privado, que varios de ustedes ya han estado involucrando, participando, y que se concibe como un repositorio de información en línea para el seguimiento de la participación del sector privado en esa cooperación al desarrollo. Y eso implica también una serie de investigaciones, de estudios de casos de las unidades de ejecución de la OED en todo el mundo, y eso nos permite también tener una radiografía muy clara sobre cómo están desarrollándose esas acciones del sector privado. El mismo hecho de tener este observatorio del sector privado va a consistir en investigaciones, estudios de caso que examinan esas iniciativas y dan cuenta a nivel nacional o subnacional cómo está actuando el sector privado en relación a los principios de la cooperación al desarrollo, y también cómo están las empresas multinacionales, las transnacionales, cómo están en esa asociación pública-privada, que necesitamos también valorar desde las organizaciones de sociedad civil el seguimiento y el cumplimiento a esos programas de desarrollo. También nos sirve para animar a las diferentes regiones a buscar ejemplos de iniciativas dirigidas muy puntualmente a fomentar asociaciones de desarrollo eficaces como agentes económicos locales de cambio. Ahí ubicamos a las pequeñas, a las medianas, a las microempresas, que son uno de los actores fundamentales en este desarrollo que queremos promover de cara a la implementación también de esa agenda mínima, Agenda 2030. Y por otro lado, ayudar a las unidades ejecutoras a llevar a cabo esta investigación. Prácticamente el grupo de trabajo elaboró este manual que vamos a conocer el día de hoy, que nos va a permitir ser una pieza clave en esta sesión también de aprendizaje y que esperamos todos puedan aportar. Vamos a conocer más tarde el manual de las OSC para el seguimiento del compromiso del sector privado en la cooperación al desarrollo, y nos va a brindar herramientas, nos va a dotar de instrumentos que podamos socializar. Esta sesión de aprendizaje pues tiene el objetivo principal es de socializar ese manual, que podamos analizarlo, discutirlo, ver sus conceptos, ver cómo vamos a evaluar el cumplimiento de esos principios, y explicar las directrices también de marcos y métodos que podemos utilizar en esta investigación. Proporcionar un espacio para abordar las preocupaciones y promover ese aprendizaje entre los procesos que nos interesan monitorear en el sector privado, en el ámbito de la cooperación al desarrollo. Y por último, reforzar nuestras capacidades como regiones para llevar a cabo esas investigaciones y esos estudios. Gracias, espero que hoy sea un gran día y que podamos dialogar sobre este tema y aprender mucho más y ponernos de acuerdo cómo va a actuar cada uno de los países. Un saludo para ustedes. Gracias.
Gracias, Georgina, for those wonderful opening words on why we need to monitor private sector engagement in order to improve development cooperation in line with development effectiveness principles. Now, we present a recorded discussion of the CS of a dis, of a discuss, we present a recorded discussion of the CSO Handbook for monitoring private sector engagement in development cooperation. Introducing the CSO Handbook is our consultant, who is a Bachelor of Science in Statistics from the University of the Philippines and a graduate of Master of Science in Development Studies at the London School of Economics. He is also a senior lecturer at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, and an assistant professorial lecturer at De La Salle University. Please welcome Paul Quintos.
Good evening to everyone. I'd like to thank the CPDE for inviting me to share with you the overview of the Civil Society Handbook on monitoring private sector engagement in development cooperation. We prepared this handbook to equip civil society organizations with basic conceptual and technical know-how in monitoring private sector engagements in development cooperation. The handbook is divided into two main parts. The first part introduces the definitions, basic concepts about private sector engagement, the issues at stake, and also the Kampala Principles. While the second part discusses how CSOs can monitor private sector engagement at the country and sub-country level. We're hoping that with the aid of this handbook, civil society organizations can be able to produce monitoring reports and integrate these into their advocacy activities, and ultimately help ensure that private sector actors who are engaged in development cooperation are more accountable to the people. First off, I'd like to clarify who or what we are talking about when we refer to the private sector. In this handbook, the private sector refers to entities that engage in profit-seeking activities and have a majority private ownership. Of course, it must be emphasized that the private sector is not homogeneous. It includes multinational company or transnational corporations. They also include micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises who are, of course, quite different in terms of economic and even political influence compared to the former. It also includes social enterprises that are not solely profit-seeking in terms of their activities. For this handbook, we also treat cooperatives or independent producers or say self-employed street vendors as not part of what we talk about when as the private sector, in the sense that we feel that they should be treated differently from other primarily profit-seeking enterprises, which is our primary concern here. Now, when we speak of development cooperation, we define this as we adopt the common definition of development cooperation, which is that these are activities that aim explicitly to support national for international development priorities. They are not driven by profit. They discriminate in favor of developing countries and are based on cooperative relationships that seek to enhance developing country ownership. Now, based on these two definitions, we see that when we speak of private sector engagement in development cooperation, there is a built-in tension or contradiction, as it were, between the profit orientation of the private sector and the not-for-profit orientation of development cooperation. It's for this reason that CSO, civil society, has a vital role to play in monitoring and ensuring that when private sector entities engage in development cooperation or are engaged in development cooperation, they are truly contributing to development objectives. Now, private sector engagement in development cooperation usually refers to two main forms. One is private sector investment for development, which are meant to benefit various stakeholders, including low-income or marginalized groups, rather than just maximizing benefits for stakeholders or investors in an enterprise. For example, social enterprises that offer products of high social value, such as, say, fair trade coffee. Of course, it's wise not to accept every claim of a social enterprise or even a big corporation that claims to produce goods or services of high social value. That's something that we need to evaluate whether they're true or not. Now, another major form of private sector engagement in development cooperation is private sector finance for development. A common example of this is blended financing, where official development assistance is combined with private sector financing for development projects. Usually, ODA serves as a way to reduce risk, offset risks, so that private sector financing can flow to otherwise under-invested but socially beneficial activities. This form also includes what is more commonly known as private-public partnerships. Usually, these are contracts that involve as the name implies, the private sector and the public sector to build infrastructure or to provide social services. Usually with some form of guarantees from the government or governments, as well as regulatory oversight on the part of government, whereas the private sector takes on the either financing or actual operation of the project. Now, for CPDE, however, an important and relatively neglected form of private sector engagement in development cooperation involves medium to small MSMEs, medium and small enterprises. These are particularly notable and important for CPDE because these are the MSMEs, the single biggest private sector force in terms of employment and therefore in terms of the direct impact on working people, especially in developing countries. Yet compared to big businesses, MSMEs usually have less access to finance and other forms of public support. So for CPDE, MSMEs engagement for development cooperation must be approached differently from big business engagement in development cooperation. Now, despite the official hype about the developmental contributions of the private sector in terms of achieving, let's say, the SDGs or net zero climate targets, or now increasingly you would hear the emphasis on the role of the private sector in building back better for a post-pandemic future. Now, there are many reasons to be wary of this hype. First, studies indicate that most business activities are in fact not aligned with SDGs, especially in terms of, let's say, environmental goals or promoting sustainable consumption and production and climate targets. Mm. In short, SDGs for which SDGs which do not align well with profit profit oriented undertakings are not well supported or are not well aligned with private sector priorities, which is to be expected, right? Second, many SDGs are neglected, such as goals related to biodiversity and resource conservation, for the same reason. No? Third, blended financing is often or does not commonly flow to countries that are most in need. No, I mean, more blended financing goes to, say, upper middle income or lower middle income countries compared to low income countries or least developed countries. Third, blended financing does not flow to countries um, that sorry. Also, fourth, as already mentioned, MSMEs are relatively neglected compared to, let's say, multinational corporations and big business in terms of participation in development cooperation. And fifth, these big business sector involved in private sector in, engagement in development cooperation are often not held accountable for the adverse social and environmental consequences of their activities, let alone their SDG promises. Sorry. For instance, a recent study of private-public partnerships in Europe, published by Eurodad and the European Federation of Public Sector Unions, published last year, reveals that the numerous dangers of relying on PPPs for infrastructure and social services. For instance, they conclude that many PPPs do not actually bring you money, but they create hidden debt. No, they don't bring you money because, in fact, what they're doing is they're relying on um, private sector debt, which if instead the actually governments actually access that kind of financing, they would have obtained that same financing at lower rates. So in effect, PPPs don't bring in new money. Private finance costs more than government borrowing. Public authorities often bear the ultimate risk of project failure when the expectations of PPPs are not met. Public authorities are obliged to step in and take up the slack in terms of revenue or in terms of other risks to the project. They're not as promised. Many PPPs are opaque, and then they also involve corruption. There are some cases documented in that report, and they distort public policy priorities in that because PPPs are often aligned with profit-oriented motives of the investors, which also have developmental objectives, but other developmental objectives with no promising revenues for the private sector are neglected. So in that sense, it sort of skews government priorities in terms of public financing as well. So there are some dangers to PPPs, and we're talking about PPPs in Europe, right, where governments have greater regulatory capacity compared to most developing regions. So it's even more important for the civil society and other stakeholders be um, to be vigilant in terms of monitoring the private sector engagement in developing countries, in the name of development cooperation. Now, partly in response to concerns raised by civil society about private sector engagement in development cooperation, governments, business representatives, and other stakeholders agreed to the Kampala Principles for effective private sector engagement through development cooperation in 2019. These principles set norms for enhancing private sector engagement toward achieving national sustainable development priorities. The Kampala Principles consists of 5 major principles. I won't go through the details of each, but Principle 1 pertains to inclusive country ownership, which is about strengthening coordination, alignment, capacity building. Principle 2 is about results and targeted impact. Principle 3 is about inclusive partnerships. Principle 4 is about improving transparency and accountability. And principle 5 is about leaving no one behind, no? Recognizing and sharing and mitigating risks for all partners. Now, these while these Kampala principles have been welcomed by many stakeholders, no, for enhancing private sector, for at least for aiming to enhance private sector engagement for development cooperation, they are not free of criticisms. So CSOs such as CPDE, for instance, point out that the Kampala Principles still emphasize puts an emphasis on profitable solutions to sustainable development challenges, which may overshadow the most pressing goal of addressing the roots of poverty and inequality, which may require initiatives that obviously are or often not necessarily profitable, that might even be contrary to corporate interests. The framework also remains voluntary and non-binding, so there's no uh, real oversight mechanisms or actionable remedies if there is, non-adherence to these principles. The onus of proving private sector contribution to sustainable development lies with the private sector themselves. No? So it's self-monitoring and self-regulation. Therefore, there's a need for the integration of a monitoring framework to document compliance and non-compliance of development actors. Now, for these reasons, the CPD has a three-pronged approach to private sector engagement in development cooperation. One prong, of course, would be monitoring business behavior to ensure accountability at the minimum, to the Kampala Principles, and of course to SDGs and other human rights norms and conventions. A second prong, of course, would be advocating for greater government regulation and an appropriate and effective regulatory framework for PSE engagement in development cooperation. And third, as I've also mentioned earlier, CPDE supports or promotes the involvement of MSMEs, in particular, in development cooperation. So, in line with that, the in line with this framework or approach of the CPDE, the CPDE enjoins civil society organizations to map out private sector engagement in development cooperation in their respective countries. This starts with identifying private sector initiatives tied to development cooperation, assessing to what extent these initiatives are aligned with SDGs, assessing to what extent these initiatives adhere to the Kampala Principles and, let's say, other human rights norms in actual practice. Um, Now, the handbook identifies some specific areas for CSO monitoring in line with the Kampala principles. For instance, in Principle 1, one area that should be or can be investigated by civil society is whether there's a national framework or PSE in development cooperation in their country. How does this framework reflect the priorities and objectives of development actors, including MSMEs? Are these projects aligned with national development priorities and the 2030 agenda for sustainable development and so on? So I don't have time to go through all the suggested areas for monitoring. So I strongly recommend that we refer to the handbook. But these cover all the principles, all the Kampala principles, and some indicators of these 5 principles. Our data sources for this monitoring exercise include official documents from government, as well as primary data gathered through, of course, key informant interviews and focus group discussions with various stakeholders, especially affected communities. Now, the handbook includes some guide questions for the conduct of stakeholder analysis at the country and sub-country level. As you can see from the slide. Now, again, I don't have time to go through each one. So I again encourage you to refer to the handbook provided by CPDE. Plus, I believe that you will have more time to discuss the practical details of conducting the monitoring exercise in the following parts of the program today or tonight, depends where you are, as well as through succeeding consultations with the CPDE Secretary. So that's all I can share for now. And I wish you a very fruitful discussion and collaboration. So thank you and bye for now.
All right. That was a very comprehensive introduction to the CSO Handbook and the CPDE's approach from Paul. We hope that everyone has gotten quite a bit of insight as to the significance and current concerns of PSE and the need for civil society monitoring. Now, to present the guidelines for the case study research, it's one of our very own from the CPDE Task Force on Private Sector Engagement. Our global coordinator for the Reality of Aid Network, please welcome Mark Pascual.
Thank you, Bruno. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm Mark Pascual, Coordinator of Reality of Aid Network, and I'm here to present the guidance note for the CPDE research on private sector engagement in development cooperation, which deals with the more practical side of how we're going to implement this research. A copy of the guidance note was sent to the Secretariats of Regions and Sectors last August 31st through the CPD Secretariat's mailing list. But for those who did not receive it, please feel free to message us on the chat box and include your email so we can send you a copy for reference. Next slide, please. Now, before we get into the specifics of the research guidelines, I'd like to briefly go through an overview of the main project we are implementing, which is the Private Sector Watch, or PS Watch in short. As mentioned earlier by previous speakers, the PS Watch is a program deliverable of the CPDE, which is facilitated by the Task Force on Private Sector Engagement. It will be implemented in a span of 2 years. So we have year one and year two funding. We are currently implementing year one, which includes setting up the initial infrastructure for the online hub and generating initial evidence through research outputs from the regions and sectors. And just so we're all on the same page, the role of the task force here is to facilitate the implementation of the project by providing the guidelines, providing the framework, and ensuring that regions and sectors are able to deliver. The main implementers of this project would still be the CPD constituencies through the research outputs that they will produce. The Private Sector Watch is meant to be an online repository of information to monitor private sector engagement. It's still very much in development. The plan is to have it online towards the second quarter of next year, but the idea is very similar to the Aid Observatorio, as Georgina mentioned earlier, if you're familiar with that project. But the PS Watch gives particular focus on private sector monitoring. Ultimately, what we want to get out of the PS Watch platform is evidence whether private sector, mainly through TNCs and MNCs, are implementing effectiveness principles, whether they continue to violate people's rights across sectors and regions, and from there provide recommendations on what can be done to better align private sector actions with sustainable development objectives. The data from the research outputs coming from regions and sectors will feed into this hub and will be accessible online. And the data that we'll be able to gather will inform our advocacy towards the GPEDC, specifically the action area on private sector engagement, among other engagement arenas that we seek to engage. Next slide, please. In order to produce the necessary information that will feed into this online infrastructure that we are building, we drafted the CSO Handbook for monitoring private sector engagement. Now, this has been discussed thoroughly by our first speaker, so I won't go into details, but I wanted to highlight this framework or the three-pronged approach of CPDE towards private sector engagement. So we basically have three nodes in our efforts to monitor private sector effectiveness. First, we can look at advocacies for greater government regulation of private sector behavior. Second is monitoring business behavior itself for accountability. And the last component would be on promoting MSMEs, considering their lack of access to finance and public support, and the underlying principle that MSMEs are key to the development of national industries and the generation of domestic employment opportunities, as discussed by Mr. Paul Quintos earlier. Now, this guidance note is meant really to complement the handbook. So the handbook, as discussed by the author, is really the conceptual foundation of what we want to do with the research. The guidance note, on the other hand, would be the how-to, the practical tips, the guidelines that you will need to finish the research. So just before I begin, I just wanted to acknowledge that some of the regions and sectors have already begun working on, or some are actually done working on their private sector research even before the handbook and this guidance note came out. And we understand the situation, and we will provide some allowance to accommodate those constituencies who are in that situation. We can discuss that further later. Next slide, please. The objectives of the research is quite straightforward. First, we want to present information and analysis on the effectiveness of private sector actors with particular attention on TNCs and MNCs. We mentioned that they here that the main focus of the private sector watch and this research in particular is to look at TNC operations. And we encourage all constituencies to look into that aspect. But in exceptional cases, of course, this doesn't preclude us from monitoring MSMEs as well. But we have to keep in mind, as Paul mentioned as well, that the reason why we want to monitor TNCs is that the onus or responsibility to deliver on sustainable development is really upon the shoulders of big businesses, not on small, medium-sized enterprises. For MSMEs, we take a different attitude, which is to promote their sustainable practices and help them improve their effectiveness, advocate for their inclusion in development partnerships. With the underlying principle that we need MSMEs for the development of national industries, which is key to employment and sustainable and inclusive growth. The second objective of this research is to engage the GPEDC in their efforts to implement and monitor the Kampala Principles. Of course, this doesn't preclude us from holding private sector actors accountable to other existing minimum standards, such as the business and human rights principles, for example. But since we are CPDE is engaging the GPEDC primarily at this point, we have to monitor the Kampala Principles in spite of the criticisms that we have on that standard. Thirdly, we want to create a space for CSOs to participate in the monitoring of private sector activities in development cooperation. The context here is that in the GPEDC monitoring process, our role in contributing to the monitoring of indicator 3, which is on private sector, has been really limited in the past. And we want to push that by creating our own space and generating our own data, which can be used for that purpose. Next slide, please. Now, onto the structure, which is the more practical side of doing this research. What you see here is a recommended outline for the output from regions and sectors. As mentioned, this is just recommendatory, and the regions and sectors are free to modify this as needed, depending on how they want to frame their contributions. But generally speaking, what we want to see from the outputs are these. We start with the introduction first, which should include country context. And given the current situation, what has been the impact of COVID-19 on how civil society engages the private sector, or conversely, how did the COVID-19 affected private sector operations in general? Alternatively, how COVID-19 impacted private sectors ability or capacity to provide for labor rights, for example, in some cases. So those are just specific examples. So for the introduction part, the general idea is to get a sense of the business environment, whether it is in favor of private sector and how, for instance, big businesses are using this favorable environment to further profits at the expense of labor rights and the environment. The second part, which would be the meat and potatoes of the research, is an analysis of how Kampala principles are being implemented by a specific corporation or in the context of a specific project. In many cases, these would be public-private partnerships or PPPs. This section, we ideally want to see a project mapping framework, which is included in the CSO Handbook. The project mapping should reveal some basic information about the corporation and the project. What's the name of the corporation? Where is it based? Where is its headquarters? How much does the project cost? How much funding do they receive from the government, for example? So these are just sample questions you could explore. we also want to see an assessment of the corporation's activities or projects based on the Kampala Principles. So if you look at the CSO Handbook, you'll see a part on integrating Kampala Principles. I believe Paul also went through with this earlier in his input, wherein there are several guide questions or suggested areas for monitoring, which you can use to help you form your assessment and reach a conclusion on how these corporations are implementing or not implementing the Kampala Principles. And lastly, we want to conclude the research with a set of actionable recommendations. Next slide, please. Now moving on to length and style. The contributions should be a minimum of 2,000 and a maximum of 3,000 words. Many of our target audiences won't have time to parse through long-winded documents. So the research outputs are encouraged to be brief and concise with their analysis and conclusions, which gives it higher chances to be read and utilized. All contributions of the research will be posted on the Private Sector Watch platform and will be downloadable individually as separate publications. And then please remember to avoid jargon and pure text in your outputs. In cases where technical terms cannot be avoided, make sure to provide a glossary of terms to help readers understand the text better. Let's try to keep sentences short and simple and use powerful examples, graphics, tables, charts, or photos as much as possible to visualize the main points that we want to make. And also a reminder to make your case or argue your case using facts rather than rhetoric. And we are looking for a style that is formal but accessible, comprehensive but not necessarily academic. Next slide. So this part is really more of a reminder of the perspective we want to use in doing this research. So we want it to be anchored on the reality and experience of marginalized sectors and communities. The contributions analyzing private sector activities must be anchored on specific illustrative examples or case studies. So for example, the author could give an overview of what's happening in one developing country or region in relation to the subject, but there should be enough space for a deep dive into one specific project or corporation, private sector actor partnering with the government. We also want to explore the experiences of developing countries, communities, and civil society organizations that reflect the interests of people living in poverty in relation to issues of private sector-led initiatives that are relevant. Now, if you have other ideas on how to explore the theme, you can contact us through the current facilitator of the task force private sector engagement, which is Tala Batangan. She's in this call. Tala, if you can just send your email in the chat box for reference later. Next slide, please. Yeah. Now we want as much as possible for the process of writing the research itself to be an opportunity for sectors and regions to do their own lobbying, action, and dialogue. So we encourage you to consider the following. If you are referring to specific organizations or government agencies, you can use this writing process to build dialogue or to establish some engagement to debate these issues. We understand that taking this approach can be time consuming and can be challenging, especially if you plan to take on a critical line, but dialogue provides the chance to make the case directly to the people and the institutions and agencies concerned, and may even strengthen the outcome of the research. Ideally, we want the research contributions to not merely comment on what is wrong, but should also offer concrete ideas on how things could be done better. In our experience, open-minded policymakers can be receptive to ideas that are written within their remit and items that they can actually implement. So if possible, please include specific and actionable recommendations for change. Next slide, please. So for references, just make sure to cite your sources in an EndNotes format. If you include graphs, just please indicate the data sources for the graph. Additionally, indicate the appropriate number entitled to all graphs, tables, or other illustrations as much as possible, and provide the graphs and tables in Excel format to enable the layout artist to better format the graph or table. Next slide, please. Now, the last part of my presentation is on the timetable. This has been revised to take account of developments in how we have thus far implemented this particular deliverable. So starting off with the approval of the research guidelines in the CSO Handbook, we had this signed off with the Task Force PSE last August 13th. The documents underwent some revisions in the period of August 14 to 30, including some comments from the sectors and regions. We released the guidance note in the CSO Handbook last August 31st, as I mentioned, through the Secretariat mailing list. It's now available. The handbook is now available in the Reality of Aid website. We will paste the link on the Zoom chat for everyone's reference. Now, since the guidelines in the handbook were released August 31st, the assumption is that authors, meaning the constituencies, would have a total of 3 months to finish the research. So that's the period of September 1st to December 15th this year. We're having this learning session today, November 11th, to answer some of the questions you might have in the midst of implementing this research. And we're tentatively scheduling an external launch of the CSO Handbook on December 12th. They the date for the UN Business and Human Rights Forum this year. And the deadline for submissions is set on December 15th. The copy-edited versions of the contributions must be signed off by individual constituencies by January 31st next year. And during that whole period, beginning with the submissions, the synthesis chapter should already be starting until February 4th. This would imply that we send the final outputs for sign-off to the PSE task force by February 7th, after which it goes to layout and final proofreading until February 18th, and we will launch the research on February 28th next year. So that's the proposed timetable. This timetable was also presented, a version of this was presented during the All Secretariats meeting we had a few months ago, if I remember correctly, and there hasn't been much change except for some delays in the external launch and the date for this learning session. Otherwise, the deadline for submissions are generally the same towards the end of this year. All right, so that's the main points of the guidance note. Again, for those who do not have a copy, please message us so we can send it to you directly. But there, I stop here. Thank you. Back to you, Bruno.
All right. Right. Thank you so much. Uh, Thank you so much for the very instructive run through of the guidelines, Mark. And now we open the floor for our open discussion, where we can address questions and concerns regarding the project, the handbook, and the guidelines. So just a reminder that you may send your thoughts through the chat, any questions or concerns you may have. You may also click raise hand. The raise hand button is there, the bottom of your Zoom screen, of your Zoom window. Uh, Click it so you may be acknowledged and unmute yourself. Leo has also posted the link to our CSO handbook for private sector engagement. Uh, we'd also like to encourage our constituencies here from the regions and the sectors to perhaps share your experiences in your respective regions or sectors so that we may all learn about the general condition of uh, private sector engagement. All right, we have a hand raised. That's Kurniawan. Kurniawan,
Yeah, hello.
you may.
Hello.
Yes, go ahead, Wawan.
Yes, I have a simple question actually. Based on the definition of private sector itself, whether the state-owned enterprises and financial institution also covered in these definitions of the private sector. That's all my question.
Yes, I think Mark will answer.
Yes, so just a very quick answer to that. Yes, IFIs are covered in what we consider the private sector. In fact, you will see that referenced in the CSO Handbook. And
And
of
what
course,
about
yeah,
state-owned enterprises?
state-owned enterprises it's currently
State-owned
not.
enterprises.
Yeah, so state-owned enterprises are not currently in the framework of what we are monitoring. But thank you for raising that question. We can have that discussion further. But at the moment, what we really want to look at would be transnational corporations and multinational corporations, and in some cases, micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, but with the differentiation that our attitude towards them would be more about promoting the role in development partnerships and helping them access more support from the government. So that's how the framework is currently set. But of course, I think that the discussion on state-owned enterprises warrants further thinking, Wawan. But thank you very much for raising that. That's something we can park for now, I think, because I don't have the definite answer for that, unless other colleagues have um, responses to that question from Wawan. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Wawan, again for
Thank you,
that.
Marcoy.
Khurshid has a question here. Hi, everyone. Is it also possible to send guidance notes? Yes. After this activity, we will also, alongside the CSO handbook, we will also be sending out, resending rather, the guidance notes for the private sector watch. And Georgina has raised her hand. Georgina, please, feel free to share.
Sí, bien, saludo a todos y todas. Nos gustaría compartir con ustedes que en el caso de Latinoamérica y el Caribe tenemos serios problemas de acceso a la información pública y sobre todo al proceso de las alianzas públicas-privadas. Consideramos desde la región que nuestros estudios van a ir más enfocados en el caso de la pequeña, mediana empresa y de las micro, pero vamos a hacer también un esfuerzo por monitorear la presencia de las transnacionales, sobre todo las grandes maquilas, las zonas francas, o quisiéramos monitorear también el impacto que ha tenido esta implementación del sector privado en proyectos energéticos, que creo que es algo que nos interesa muchísimo, pero también me gustaría saber cómo se está pensando el número de estudios de casos por regiones. Si ustedes tienen ya una definición sobre esto.
Yeah, so Mark,
Hi, hi. Thanks, Georgina, for that question, and I thank you again for being here despite the time being too early, I believe, in Nicaragua, and for the others as well from Latin America, especially. Just to answer your question, in terms of the number of case studies per region, the idea is to focus on one case study because we are also considering that we have a very limited um, funding for this project. I believe it's €1,000 per constituency, so that's not much to produce um, a more comprehensive research beyond what is currently being asked, which is a maximum of 3,000 words. So I think that's enough for one case study. And it's good to note that the Latin American region would be focusing on MSMEs. That's um, uh, a good approach to also explore how MSMEs in the region can further be helped in efforts to increase their role in development partnerships and support from the government. So that's all I would say at the moment. But also just a reminder that we are currently in the first year of implementing this. We would have another year of implementation next year. So if you want to focus now on MSMEs, that's not a problem. But next year would have another opportunity to look at other aspects of private sector actors you would be interested in looking at. So just that reminder that we have 2 years of implementation and we'll have another one for next year. Thank you. I hope that answers your question, Georgina.
all right. Thank you, Georgina, for sharing the Latin American region's plans for private sector research, and also thanks, Mark, for giving us uh, more details on the implementation of the private sector watch project. Uh, so that's the Latin American region. We also have participants here from other constituencies, including Asia Pacific, Middle East, North Africa, Africa, uh, and Europe, I believe. So, if anyone here, anyone else would like to uh, share their current plans or perhaps raise any concerns, please feel free to do so. All right. So Diwa here has a question. Could you give a simple explanation for the forms of private sector engagement as enumerated in the handbook? That's in page 6 of the CSO handbook. Mark?
Hi, Diwa. Thanks for that question. Are you referring to the two forms of PSE? Am I correct?
Yes.
Right. So I think you can. I encourage everyone to refer back to the video that was presented earlier, the presentation of Paul Quintos. I believe that will be made available for all participants for their access later on. But just to answer Diwa's question, the first form of private sector engagement would be a form that emphasizes share uh, emphasizes value for stakeholders rather than investors. So that would include activities made by some MSMEs or some social enterprises whose main objective is not primarily for profit. The other form of private sector engagement in development cooperation would be more about leveraging public finance for private gains. So that's how I would simplify the explanation of Paul in terms of those two forms of private sector engagement and development cooperation. Hope I answered your question, Diwa.
All right. Thanks, Diva, for that question, and thanks, Mark, again, for the response. Yes, Norgul has raised her hand. Norgul, please feel free.
Dear friends, thank you very much for this very good call. I just want to ask, or just ask first, how do you see the role of the feminist group in order to consider integration of feminist perspectives, women's rights protection during the case studies, so that women's rights were also followed? And how do you see, do you have a specific role for FG to help or to do anything related to the case study analysis or something? This is first. Second, I just want to ask if we have in the guidelines, sorry, I didn't read that, in the guidelines something on protection, ensuring that women's rights are integrated in the whatever PSC or transnational cooperation analysis.
Okay, I'll respond, Nurul. Thank you for raising that question. So first of all, I think this concern was raised prior, and we during the drafting process for the CSO handbook, if you remember, and we integrated some questions on how the monitoring for private sector engagement in development cooperation could integrate a feminist lens, and seeing how these private sector initiatives impact on women's rights. Now, in terms of the guidance note, I think that's something we could also consider. But at this point, we have already released the guidance note. But I would say that in the process of submissions, the submissions from sectors and regions would also go through the task force PSE, with which Nurgul, I remember you are a member.
Yes, and Patricia also member from our FG group.
Yes,
from
Patricia.
Africa.
So I think we can have that discussion there for feedbacking on whether the case studies submitted by the regions and sectors need further revision to include feminist lens, to include gender safeguarding analysis.
Excellent.
I think we can do that in the private sector task force. So thank you for raising that, Nurgul, and I think that serves also a reminder for all of the constituencies here to include a feminist lens in drafting your research. Thank you.
That's why I was raising this, that we raised it, but because we are now meeting with everyone who will be involved in the research, I just wanted to remind that please consider this perspective. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Norgul, for raising the need to include the feminist lens in our private sector research. Uh, Thank you, Mark, for your response. Okay. Jodel has raised his hand.
Yeah, thanks, Bruno. Thanks, Mark. And thanks, Nurgul, for raising the concern on gender mainstreaming. So this is one of the concerns actually raised by the different by the feminist group to CPDE, how to ensure mainstreaming issue of the gender lens in our work. And CPDE as CSO platform has been committed to doing this. And I agree with the way forward that Mark has suggested, and I hope that the constituencies agree also. It's just actually a request for Norgul if you have documents that could help our constituencies to ensure that we integrate the gender lens on doing this monitoring. I think that would be helpful, not only to the constituencies but also to the task forces that we have. So that's a request for the feminist group, and I hope, and I'm sure that Norgul will agree and will have documents to support this. Thanks, Nurgul.
We'll develop it. Thank you very much. Patricia from Ghana and me, we shall develop something and share with you. And it would be good if people if we miss something during the process of research, if you have some question, contact us and we will learn together. Thank you.
Thanks,
All right.
Nurgul.
Thanks, Nurgul, and thanks, Jodel, for reaching out. We'd also like to invite Aaron, who is here. Aaron is from the Asia Pacific Mission for Migrants, or ATM, who are part of the migrant constituency of CPDE. The migrants constituency, I believe, has already started on their research on private sector engagement. Aaron, could you share a bit of the progress and the background for us?
Thank you very much. Yeah, we did already start writing actually a paper with regards to migration and the private sector. Our effort for this started pre-COVID as an initial study session to explore the intersection of migration and private sector to locate where the engagement of migrants should be in terms of with regards to the private sector. So the paper has been developed. We have already circulated it to the international coordinating group of the constituency, and hopefully could be finalized within the next few weeks. And we're planning to hold a sort of a forum to echo the points, the highlights of the paper, and further improve based on the inputs of other organizations of migrants and diaspora. So basically, we haven't really locked in yet on what would be the private sector engagement of the constituency. Though of course, on the ground there are ongoing campaigns and struggles already and engagements of migrants organizations in relation to the private sector, businesses, banks that are all involved in the migration process from recruitment to deployment to return of migrants. So we're looking on those phases of migration to determine private sector involvement. But of course, at the end of it, there is the issue about private sector's development role, or the role of the private sector in underdevelopment, actually, that is mainly the root cause of the vulnerabilities that migrants experience right now. So it's more of that, and hopefully when we get to have to final when we finalize the paper, we'll be circulating it to all the constituencies, sharing it with everyone, and hopefully we could see you in the forum that we would be organizing for it.
All right. Thank you so much, Aaron, for sharing the ongoing research of the migrant constituency. And yes, please look forward to CPDE's members and constituencies reaching out to see how the research has been and what its findings are. Aside from Aaron, we have other members of regional and sector constituencies here. Perhaps perhaps you would like to share any thoughts you may have at the moment, any ideas running on what you want to tackle in this private sector research. Uh, so maybe I'll ask Diwa from IPMSTL is here as a part of the IP constituency of CPDE. Diwa, do you have any current thoughts or would you like to share about perhaps what the IP constituency would like to tackle in their case study research?
Okay, thanks. Isa is actually also here. She's also the one coordinating the research. But just to give an overview of the PS Watch research for the IP constituency, so our focus are on dams in two selected countries, the dam projects, which in Northeast India and the Philippines. So we've narrowed down the scope to a few select dam projects which are either funded, operated, or developed by private entities and in partnership with the governments in the Philippines and Northeast India. So we are done with the profiling or ongoing profiling of these dam projects, and the phasing is for the first part, we are profiling the projects, and then the second part is the assessment based on the Kampala Principles, which we've also contextualized, just like the principles, we've contextualized it to the IP context. So we've reinterpreted some of the points in the Kampala Principles so that it matches the UN Declaration rights of indigenous peoples, particularly the points on self-determination and the right to free, prior, and informed consent. So maybe Isa can add more details on the progress of our research.
Yes, so in line with the timetable that was flashed by McCoy earlier, and as Diwa has mentioned, we are already on the drafting phase. We're actually just finishing up some touches on our first draft, and we've also included a very important part of it on the people's response or on the ongoing campaigns. So we could also align this research, to strengthen these ongoing campaigns, ongoing um, uh, movements by the affected indigenous communities. And so actually the the most important part of our research for the conclusion, we try to answer the question about whether private sector engagement in development cooperation, particularly these hydropower projects, benefit indigenous peoples in Northeast India and in the Philippines. So that is the primary question that we're trying to answer with this research. That's all.
All right. Thank you so much, Diwa and Lisa from the IT constituency for sharing your progress and your case study research. Now that migrant and IT constituencies have shared their ideas, perhaps some of our participants here would like to share what's cooking, what you're thinking of tackling when it comes to the research. All right. Given that, looks like we have had a fruitful time here. So just again, we would like to thank our speakers, Georgina, Paul, and Mark, for the discussion of the CSO Handbook and the guidelines for the case study research on private sector engagement. Thank you as well to our interpreters, Ashil, Tech, Maria, and Barbara, for translating our discussion for all constituencies to hear and learn. But we are thankful most of all for participants in this learning session for maximizing this venue, raise questions, and sharing your experiences in order to move forward in CPDE's private sector watch initiative. Alright, so before we end the call, we would like to ask everyone to please turn on your cameras for a moment, just for photo opportunity. Alright, for others. Okay. So just for a moment, ready? Smile. 1, 2, 3. I'm just going to move to the next page. 1, 2, 3. All right. That's that. Once again, thank you for coming here and for this productive learning session. We will be sending out a recording of this activity after the event to all our participants and all other members of the CPDE constituency. We will also provide digital copies of the CSO Handbook in English as well as in Spanish and French. And for any concerns, please don't hesitate to contact the Private Sector Engagement Task Force. Tala has provided her email earlier. We hope to hear from you more in the coming months as we work towards the Private Sector Watch. And take care, stay safe, and have a good day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.